Okay, welcome back. And this part we're going to be talking about the two comparison questions. So we're going to start with the comparison in terms of value. And hopefully at this moment you're looking at the comparison of these two works in terms of value, but it's okay if you're not, because I'm going to then go immediately backwards to look at something from the previous video, video number 4, when I was talking through these images, and hopefully right now you see the fill in the blanks questions. When I was talking about these questions, the fill in the blank questions, it was stuck on this page for some reason. But here are the fill in the blank questions. So hopefully you can kind of piece that information together. I'm going to go through it one more time. So basic form of weight bearing, post and lintel. Cast in bronze, the material is wax. 3 classical orders of architecture: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. 2 weaknesses of creative strength is an arch. In my notes, 3 main types of symmetry: axial, rotational, and radial. 3 types of clay bodies: stoneware, earthenware, and porcelain. When creating any kind of paint, you need pigment, medium, and binder. Beginning the Baroque period defined by the rivalry between Caravaggio and Carracci. Early Renaissance begins roughly in 1400 CE and roughly ends in 1475 or 1480 CE. And the period after between the Renaissance and the Baroque is called the Mannerist period. Okay, so hopefully this time you heard all that and you saw all that at the same time. I'm in a battle with my webcam program here. So, comparison in terms of value. Here we go. So, people did pretty well on this. Let's start with some of the main things, which is that, so this is, the Caravaggio is a painting, and it's a form of Baroque tenebrism, so that kind of defines a lot about how it's organized in value, whereas Dürer's is an engraving, it's a Renaissance form of printmaking. People other than the Renaissance did engraving. I'm just saying it's a Renaissance engraving, so it has those kind of values. And so in terms of value, the first thing you could note is that overall the values on the Caravaggio are much darker, especially the darkest values. They are significantly darker, and there's a lot more of them, right? Whereas the value range overall of the Dürer is overall much more mid-value. And there are some dark areas, but they're much more sporadic throughout the piece, whereas in the Caravaggio, large areas of the painting are overwhelmingly dark. Okay, the value range is wider in the Caravaggio, right? The darkest dark is darker than any of the darks on the Dürer, and the lightest lights are at least equal, but I would say actually slightly lighter than the lightest lights in the Dürer, right? So the range is much wider in the Caravaggio, much more narrow in the Dürer. And then the other thing to note is that the speed of gradation is much faster in the Caravaggio, because it's this really strong light situation where there's a very strong cast light onto these forms that are then quickly kind of like receding into darkness, whereas in the Albert Dürer print, the values are overall more mid-value, with then areas where we have spots of really dark values, and some areas spots of really light values, and some spots of really strong areas of value contrast, where we have both really light lights and really dark darks. Okay, so that's number 1 as a contrast. That's maybe 1, 2, and 3 right there. Also, how is the use of value organizing the hierarchy and emphasis? Well, one of the main things to note is that in the Caravaggio, it all leads to one primary emphasis. There are secondary emphases, but they all lead to the body of Christ and the white cloth around him. And it is part of the reason why it's such a dominant primary focus, is because it is the lightest area within a painting that is overall very dark, right? And so that leads our eye to there. Whereas in the Dürer, it's overall mid-value, and then there are a lot of competing areas of focus, many tertiary and secondary focuses, and even some competition between what are the primary focus, although I really think it's these two figures are the primary focus of the work. And most of the areas of attention are high, like let's say this area right here. Part of the reason why they are areas of attention is because they are areas of increased value contrast, where you have more lighter lights and darker darks. Okay, whereas the overall feel of the print is more mid-value. Okay, and then the last major comparison is the way that the value is created. Like I said earlier, this is a painting, so because it's a painting, the Caravaggio is a painting, because of that, the value is created through tone and through color, right? Through layers of paint. Whereas the print, the value is created through line repetition, right? Mark repetition, lots and lots of small lines, as well as contour lines and variation of weight of line, but mostly through repetition of line, just building up lines going in lots of different directions. So those are the main things to cover about that comparison. All right, and then here are two works in terms of comparison in terms of shape. And like we discussed earlier, there are some things that are very similar between these two works. The organization of the shapes in both paintings are organized very much around a grid, right? Like that we have this very rectilinear, very kind of straight grid-like organization to both paintings, right? That's one thing. Another thing that I pointed out as a difference, and I'll point out again here, is that there's a difference between the two works in terms of the obviousness of the shapes, right? Every single painting that is a painting of a person is made out of shapes. But some paintings that are paintings of a person, the shape is very clear in that it is saying, I am a shape, right? Like in this particular painting by Diebenkorn, most of these shapes, there's like, it's very, very clear, like this shadow shape on the neck, right? The way the hat is casting the shadow color onto the neck. That shape is very clearly a shape in of itself. It's not, yes, we recognize it as part of the representation of the figure, but we first and foremost recognize it as a shape choice. It's very different in the Vermeer, where we have to actually train our eyes to think of these things as all shapes, because we want to see this as a space and as a person in a space, right? We want to think of the painting literally in the way that the painting is trying to convince us, right? We want to accept the illusion of the painting. And so we have to actually think, oh, this is a shape, right? This is not a box. This is a shape and another shape and another shape. This is not a chair. This is a series of shapes, right? But that's much more hidden within the imagery of the painting than it is in the Diebenkorn. Because in the Diebenkorn, the shapes are much more obviously choices of shape. Therefore, also, the balance between the figure ground, between the positive and negative shapes, is much more obvious, and it's much more of an ambiguity between the two. There's much more tension between the shapes that are the negative space shapes and the positive shapes, because the negative space shapes feel almost as active, almost as interestingly up to the surface of the canvas, right? Because everything is kind of equally flat. Everything is also, in some ways, pushing for being equally positive. But we know that this is the negative space because we see this as a person, as something positive, as a positive figure. Okay. And then the other major thing I would say is that most of the shapes here, right, in the Vermeer are created primarily through value. It's not that there aren't colors going on here, right? But the value contrast is the main thing that we see. When our eye looks at this and it breaks things down in terms of shape, what we're seeing primarily, like we see the chair or the shapes of the chair primarily because they are overall darker than the shapes of the wall, right? Whereas in the Diebenkorn, yes, there is still strong value contrast, right? This shirt, well, let me get my cursor on it, if you can see it. This shirt here is clearly darker, right, than, the color that he's using here on the skin, or this color he's using for the negative space. But mostly what we're seeing are differences of color. Differences of color are much more important in terms of defining the shape than differences of value as they are in the Vermeer. Okay, all right. That ends this part, which I believe is part 5. I will see you in the next part momentarily.